This project, Eugenics and Disability in Washington, has several broad aims that we'll address during today's conversations. To date, there has been little research into or public dialogue about the legislative, scientific, and social history of eugenics in Washington state. Our discussions here will provide a much-needed opportunity to start learning about this history, to draw lessons about the wide-ranging implications of eugenics, and to hear some of the perspectives and stories of those individuals and communities that have been most impacted by it. My goal in this presentation is to set the stage for the discussions and no doubt the debates that we'll have throughout the day. I'll start with a brief overview of the American eugenics movement of the early 20th century, noting in particular how multifaceted it was. Then I'll speak about how important it is to frame eugenics as a disability issue, since this approach provides unique insights into this time period and why it should be critically examined today. And finally, I'll note some key aspects of what is known about Washington State's history of eugenics and what isn't known. The panel presentations and discussion will also consider these general topics I have here and provide a chance to compare our specific historical research areas. Eugenics was a science and a social reform movement that sought to improve the hereditary quality of human populations. The term was coined in 1883 by the British mathematician Francis Galton, cousin of Charles Darwin, from the Greek words for well-born. In its most common formulation, eugenics was human selective breeding, modeled on agricultural practices that manipulated reproduction and the transmission of heritable traits in order to improve the breed, right? Eugenics was the application of scientific knowledge about human biology to solving perceived social problems. By 1910, eugenics in the United States had blossomed into an organized social movement and a fairly respectable branch of scientific research under the leadership of the biologist Charles Davenport at the Eugenics Record Office on Long Island, New York. Davenport's human genetics research involved collecting family histories of a large number of physical and mental traits and conditions that he and other eugenicists presumed had a biological basis. One of the most notable traits that eugenicists studied was this catch-all category, feeble-mindedness, that I have up here on the slide. Davenport himself succinctly stated the agenda of the eugenicists and summed up why their doctrine had such wide appeal to Americans. It is a reproach to our intelligence, in Davenport's words, that we as a people should have to support about 500,000 insane, feeble-minded, epileptic, blind and deaf, 80,000 prisoners, and 100,000 paupers at the cost of over $100 million per year. And this slide also depicts an exhibit from a state fair where the lights would go on whenever supposedly someone was born who had these inborn defects and was perceived as a burden on society, too costly. There was a lot of the ideology and rhetoric behind this. Proponents of eugenics expounded what was, at the time, a progressive ideology with its rhetoric of efficiency, rational management, and race betterment. Yet the policies they proposed and implemented were frequently oppressive and paternalistic. They tended to target marginalized groups such as people of color, poor whites, women considered to be sexually promiscuous, sexual minorities and other people labeled moral delinquents, and people with various kinds of disabilities, but especially mental disabilities. They judged these groups to be, quote, socially inadequate or, quote, undesirable. This is all the terminology of the day I'm using. And the eugenicists curtailed their rights and freedoms to live independently, to marry and have families, or even to live in this country. The compulsory state-sponsored forms of eugenics included permanent segregation and forced sterilization of individuals whom panels of medical experts determined to have hereditary defects. So more than 60,000 Americans were sterilized under these laws in over 30 states, starting in 1907 and through the 1980s. The eugenics movement also had a hand in affecting severe immigration restrictions to this country. In particular, 1924 federal legislation slowed the influx of Southern and Eastern Europeans who, according to the best scientific evidence of the day, were inherently inferior. That 1924 Immigration Restriction Act also had a local Washington twist to it, as it was our Congressman, Albert Johnson, who headed the House Committee and brought in the prominent eugenicist Harry Laughlin of the Eugenics Record Office, who testified about the eugenic importance of excluding people of certain racial stocks in order to ensure no further decline in national fitness. So in short, all these defective classes of people, as they were called, were seen as a social and financial burden on society. And this anxiety trumped their rights as individuals and as minority groups. As Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said in the groundbreaking 1927 Buck versus Bell sterilization case, it is sometimes within the rightful powers and interests of the state to call upon its citizens to make sacrifices for the greater good. He saw no significant difference between the need for compulsory vaccination to prevent epidemics and the use of compulsory sterilization to prevent our being swamped with incompetence, in Holmes's words. Sexual sterilization was one type of so-called negative eugenics. That means practices that sought to discourage or forcibly prevent procreation by the unfit. Some forms of negative eugenics were implemented through legislatures and courts, but non-compulsory methods were also employed. For instance, popular films, state fair exhibits, and college courses and textbooks all explained to the general public the laws of heredity and advised people about making their own choices to have eugenic marriages, basically. Citizens were supposed to educate themselves and practice eugenic principles on a voluntary basis. On the local Washington scene, we'll hear from Steve Jones today about his research into eugenics, education, and popularization at land-grant colleges, including in Washington. So-called positive eugenics, on the flip side, which means encouraging procreation by the more highly valued classes, was also implemented mostly through such techniques of education and persuasion. For instance, from the 1910s, the Better Baby and Fitter Family contests were held at fairs across the country, including, from evidence that I have on this slide, in Washington. Here's the Puyallup Fair, a better Baby contest, and it depicts two adults, a man and a woman, holding two infants, and they are wearing some sort of distinctive cap that the winners would get. You see that on the website for where I found these materials. These contests, these Better Baby and Fitter Family contests, were held at fairs across the country. Families submitted themselves for health inspections and filled out questionnaires detailing their genetic, social, and economic histories. I mean, it even asked them what political party they belonged to, in order to win prizes similar to those awarded in livestock competitions. So by no means then was eugenics exclusively a matter of government intervention in citizens' lives, contrary to the way this history might commonly be remembered. The more relevant question, I think, especially from the point of view of current concerns about the social uses of genetic knowledge, is whether any form of eugenics involved truly voluntary decisions. American eugenics was extraordinarily popular across the social and political spectrum. It relied upon the authority of the state and of medical scientific experts, while at the same time appealing to common sense. Early 20th century eugenics was heterogeneous and malleable. I'm tempted to say that the more you know about the history of eugenics, the harder you find it to define what it was. Eugenics encompassed disparate knowledge claims, policies, and ideologies. It sometimes showed up in surprising places, such as the feminist advocacy of birth control pioneer Margaret Sanger, who already also spoke in eugenic terms of better breeding and preventing the unfit, the feeble-minded from having too many kids. Because eugenics was everywhere and meant different things to different people, it needs to be studied from a wide variety of historical perspectives, from, say, science and medical history, the history of higher education, gender and disability history, even labor history in Puerto Rico, and that's sort of the summary of the people I've invited to be on the panel this morning, the history panel, because we represent diverse subject areas and maybe even some divergent interests in why we explore what eugenics was and how it may still be relevant. Now, having said that about the heterogeneity, how different the eugenics movement was, how variable, and the fields that study it, that we have to have lots of approaches, I still think it's important on this occasion to privilege the unique perspectives that disability studies and disability rights bring to this dialogue. Disability is rarely mentioned in mainstream histories, and hence the significance of holding this symposium, as it turns out, in October, Disability History Month, and we'll actually have some reference to that at the end of the day as well. And hence the importance of thinking more deeply about why the history of disability really matters. So that's not to say that the histories of other oppressed groups aren't equally important. In fact, I think that some of the most exciting work in eugenics history and disability history is happening on the topic of intersections, connections, links between historically marginalized identity categories such as disability, race, gender, and sexuality. So scholars such as Michael Rembus and Anna Stubblefield, who are here today, are demonstrating the importance of introducing the social category disability into history and philosophy. My big point here is that we need to question why eugenicists and their supporters chose to define this category disability as unfitness or social inadequacy. We already critique the way they talked about race, class, gender. Let's critique how they talked about disability and why they did that. Disability has long been the category that no other socially marginalized group wants to be lumped with. There's interesting literature on that now, too. Disability is read as deficit, as inevitable dependency, as that which should be cured or prevented. Examining eugenic thinking through a disability lens helps to expose its core emphasis, eugenics' core emphasis, on framing social problems solely in medical terms, or as we say in disability studies, on fixing the individual rather than confronting and changing the attitudes and systems that oppress people, that disable them. As scholar Alice Drager always says, let's change minds, not bodies, is a theme that I hope we pursue here today. In this regard, the framework of disability studies can also give us crucial insight into some continuities and discontinuities with current day knowledge and policies. And then lastly, briefly now, because Mark Largent is going to speak more about Washington State, but let me just summarize a bit of my current knowledge. I've just begun doing some research, and I've begun doing some research into archival sterilization records in the Washington State archives. So turning to Washington State, disability most obviously came into play in the enactment of forced sterilization. Washington had a prominent role on the national scene in that 1909, a century ago, hence we are here today, also the year of the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition, we became the second state in the country, the second to pass a sterilization law. That 1909 law empowered judges to sentence certain categories of convicted criminals to an unspecified, quote, operation to prevent procreation. That law was upheld in a 1912 state Supreme Court case, which was the very first time a sterilization statute had been challenged in a high court in this country. Some of the advocates of that law had eugenic motives and goals, but its intent was primarily punitive. Subsequent legislation across the country began to focus more strictly on restricting reproduction for eugenic ends, for this better breeding, to improve the population and reduce the numbers of unproductive members of society. And subsequent legislation across the country targeted individuals who are identified as having disabilities and who are confined in institutions. So in tune with this, but also pretty early in this game, Washington therefore passed a second sterilization statute in 1921. So you see from my little blurry map up there, the very first on the far top left, the first statutes were Indiana, then Washington, then California, then Connecticut. And then you see how the states fill in over the next few decades, going down the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and about 30-something states eventually had sterilization laws. So by the Washington 1920 law, this one was meant to be more comprehensive, targeting, as I said, individuals with disabilities who had been committed to state institutions. And this one was also more comprehensive in that it was supposed to be both eugenic for the protection of society, or the superintendents, the doctors of the asylums, could submit someone to sterilization if the doctor thought it was in their therapeutic interest to do so. It could be considered a treatment that you couldn't have any more kids. So there's an interesting complexity that was actually reflected in a lot of eugenics statutes across the country. According to the tallies gathered by the superintendents and the state director of health here in Washington, a total of 685 individuals were sterilized in Washington under the 1921 law. So we were not anywhere near the most prolific. If you see some of the posters I have outside, you'll see California sterilized 20,000 and Oregon sterilized 3,000 or something like that. But we were early in the game. The vast majority of the sterilizations here occurred during the late 1930s, when economic anxieties about caring for large, warehoused, institutionalized populations were accentuated. The superintendents were eager to sterilize and then parole as many eligible patients and inmates as possible. And as you see in the letters in the state archives, the superintendents are expressing this impatience at how infrequently the Institutional Board of Health, that's what the Eugenics Board was called here, the Institutional Board of Health, was able to meet. They just weren't meeting often enough. So I'm actually still trying to figure out how often did they meet, how accurate is this total of 685 sterilizations. By contrast, under that 1909 law, few, if any, people seem to have been sterilized, and keep in mind that 1909 law is still on the books today. It's still there for sterilizing convicted habitual criminals. The 1921 statute was overturned in 1942 in the Hendrickson case before the state Supreme Court. And in that ruling, the court said the law violated constitutional rights to procedural due process because the law did not provide adequate opportunity for the patient to file an appeal. But the justices in that decision agreed that the concept of eugenic sterilization was valid. So what I've also found in the surviving archival records pertaining to the operation of the 1921 law is that the medical and state authorities were extremely conscious of the long history in the US of state courts overturning various eugenics laws, sterilization laws. And so the superintendents actually set up these forms and this procedure where they were getting what they called consent from the patient and a guardian or a family member. And again, you see this in the patient records, in the archives, the signatures of people saying they agreed to be sterilized. So again, a twist, a complexity of this history, I think. So disability appears prominently in these records, and I have some of them on display in the corridor as you're able to go and circulate and see the materials we have today. Disability appears prominently, and in regards to opening up questions about how mental illness and intellectual disability were socially constructed in this time and place. Usually on these forms, there's little evidence from the surgeons, the superintendents, little evidence that they're giving to support any kind of claim that this individual has a hereditary defect, so to speak. There isn't a lot of information about their family histories and so on. The patient files include frequent references to sexual behaviors, and about 2/3 of the cases are women. The records also include some purported transcripts of Institutional Board of Health meetings where patients were interviewed to determine whether they qualified for sterilization. And several of these record individuals brought before the board who seem to have agreed that sterilization was in their own best interest. And perhaps this is women thinking this is a viable form of birth control for them at this time and place. So I'm just starting this research. I'm not going to draw any conclusions that I don't yet have here. I just wanted to fill you in a little bit about some of the knowledge that's out there. It's clear that this history is quite complicated. Mark Largent, who's here today, has demonstrated this in his book Breeding Contempt for States Across the Nation. And I'm going to leave it there. And as Mark speaks, he's going to talk a little bit more about Washington eugenics. I also have a new friend here, Louis Musso, in the front, who had done some research about the sterilization laws in Washington. So he may want to make a comment eventually as we go on. So again, thank you all, and let's get on to the panels. Thanks.